consulting. I'm sure that many of you have considered management consulting roles or strategy consulting roles, but I just wanted to make participants aware that a lot of students are now showing an interest in breaking into digital and tech consulting roles. And this is because this particular niche is the growing field which encompasses a lot of digital and strategic transformation initiatives that firms are interested in. So it's one of the fastest growing fields within consulting, both strategic consulting and management consulting more generally. And there is also a significant effort to hire an increasing number of graduates across various different industries. So as you can see in the bottom of the slide, I have included reference to the undergraduate and graduate opportunities that are available across a multitude of sectors. So it's not only your traditional tech firms like Apple, Google, Microsoft that hire technology consultants. It's also the Big Four accounting firms and also niche specialized consulting firms, as well as your traditional firms that focus just on technology and digital recruitment. The other thing I would say is at this stage, a lot of students initially worry because they feel as if they need to be super technical, but I just wanted to make you aware that you don't have to necessarily have a computer science background. They accept students from all backgrounds, all academic disciplines. You don't also have to know how to code. That's a question that comes up a lot. You do have to have a general understanding of the business and digital capabilities that firms are interested in. So for example, you'd be asked during your interviews whether firms can harness data in a better way, whether you can digitize customer experiences. So at a very high level, it's a role in which you advise clients on how they can digitally transform via the implementation of digital capabilities, right? So at a high level, this would be all aspects of digital social media marketing, big data, data analytics, artificial intelligence. And now, there's also move towards recruitment on the metaverse element, right? So it's a great space to be in because it's constantly growing, it's very dynamic. And you will have the opportunity to provide value to clients through the entire technology lifecycle. So what do I mean by this? Not only will you play a part in assessing the business issues, you help to outline and define the end-to-end technological roadmap. And then you'll also be working with clients to establish digital trends, right? So for example, a client might come to you and say that they're finding it very hard to recruit millennials, or they're finding it hard to create a digital marketing strategy. So think of it as a normal business consulting role, but with a very strong emphasis on digital and technological trends. So I'll pause at this stage and see if there's any initial questions on what the role is or the type of candidates that they look for. And happy for this session to be interactive, so feel free to jump in at any point. Any questions? Okay, perfect, great. So in terms of what they look for in
candidates. Sorry, Sana, yeah. Grace has her hand up.
Oh, someone put their hand up. So Mia, yeah. Actually, let me know when someone does, because I can't actually see the.
Yeah, no, I'll keep an eye.
Perfect.
Sorry.
Okay. Yes.
I was wondering, because you don't need like a computer science background or anything. So I was wondering how you picked up all this kind of technological lingo and just all the kind of business practices. I just don't know where to start.
Sure, great question. So essentially, when I was applying for roles, what I had done was try to research the latest technological trends. So back then when I was applying for roles, this was in 2016, there was a very strong emphasis on big data, right? So I would just scour the internet and try and find resources that could help me get into the role. And then to be honest, the rest of the technical skills you learn on the job once you are employed. So there isn't an expectation for you to, for example, have strong coding skills, have a very strong technical background. You don't necessarily need to know how, for example, the cloud architecture works or how the metaverse works, right? But generally, as you'll see in the case study that I'll review, If you can't bring in the key digital concepts during your interviews or your assessment center, then that's where I think that's a bit of a red flag. So essentially, that is what differentiates regular management consultant job applications from ones that are more technological focused. Yes, so Grace, essentially what I would recommend is try and see, first of all, which industry you're interested in, right? So as I said, it's not only the tech firms, but if you're interested in joining the accounting or the audit firms, they all have graduate opportunities specifically for technology consulting. Or if you wanted to join a niche consulting firm, a boutique consulting firm, then they all have avenues in, but you will have to understand what their digital specialization is. So for example, Amazon focuses heavily on AWS. That's the Amazon Web Service integration. So this is where clients can put all their data on a cloud so that all participants can view the same data in a real-time basis, right? So that specific speciality of Amazon is very different to, let's say, what Morgan Stanley might be looking for. So the first thing is figure out what niche you want to apply to, and then read up as much as you can on the technological specializations within that firm.
Thank you. That's great.
No worries. Wonderful. And then in terms of the skill sets that are needed, so you will go through the regular application process, but one thing that they do assess is your ability to be agile. So in the third bullet point, I've said that there is a strong emphasis on agility and the ability for you to respond to changing factors, both within the case study and then separately when, for example, you're being assessed in an interview, right? So one reason why some of these technology consulting applications might initially seem to be hard is because whilst you're presenting a solution, the assessor might throw something in which you hadn't considered, right? And they do that a lot, much more so than the other management consulting or strategy consulting roles. So as an example, during one of my interviews, I had presented a case on an implementation of an ERP platform. So that's an enterprise resource planning platform. It's also considered as part of this case study workshop. But as soon as I presented my recommendation, the assessor immediately said, well, what if the chief technology officer completely disagrees with your solution and wants to scrap the ERP platform? What would you do then? So you have to always have 2 or 3 responses prepared because they will throw in those curveballs. Perfect. So I'll move on to the next slide now. I get a lot of questions from students on how the application process differs from a regular management consulting role. So the good news is that similar to the other consulting roles that you will apply for, candidates still need to pass the 4 main assessment stages. So the first one is the application form. I'm sure you're already sick and tired of filling these out endlessly and then resending your CV all over again. So that happens a lot. Some firms will ask for a cover letter, which will ask for your specific motivations and why you've applied to that role. Again, one mistake that students do is that they literally copy paste responses from a standard management consulting application, and firms are very quick and good at picking that up, right? So if they haven't seen you tailor your application to the role in question, then unfortunately, a lot of applications don't pass that initial stage. You also have online psychometric tests. So in terms of the things that they test here, they'll be looking at your numerical skills. You know, they won't be extremely difficult, but you will have a time pressure obviously associated with answering those in a very quick way. So numerical questions come up a lot. There is a heavy emphasis on logical and abstract reasoning. So this is where, for those of you who haven't done these before, they'll give you certain shapes and then you'll have to determine what comes next in the pattern. And that's particularly relevant for digital consulting roles because you have to inductively reason and see patterns in data when you're employed in that role. And then finally, they expect some level of verbal reasoning skills. So this is where they try and ensure that your English aptitude is up to scale. So it's essentially, again, not different from regular applications, but a heavier focus on inductive reasoning tests. Perfect. Mia, any questions at this stage? I think I see one.
Nope. I think
Oh, there's one here.
There's a question in the chat. If the slides will be shared at the end of the session.
Yeah, so essentially these slides will be distributed. I will send a link to the website where essentially you can sign up, and we send out newsletters, and all materials that are free are published there. So you'll be able to retrieve the materials that I take you through today. Yep. Perfect. Then moving on to the interviews, again, this differs across firms, but generally you'll have an initial telephone interview followed by 1 or 2 online interviews. And then I think after COVID, as things open, a lot of the interviews are being resumed in person. So expect at least 2 to 3 interviews at least. Yep. Great. And then in terms of the case studies, this is where, again, similar to other consulting roles, you'll either be given the opportunity to partake in a case study interview. So this is where you'll be given materials like the one sheet that I distributed before, Mia and Joanna helped distribute. So they'll give you a sheet with the key facts of the case study. You'll be given 5 to 10 minutes to read it and digest materials, take notes down, and then an interview will ask you questions on the potential problems in the case study and how you can develop a solution, right? So you'll have a combination of case study interviews, or you'll be asked to work in an independent way or in a group setting to write out a case study response in a report, right? So it'll either be a verbal interaction or it'll be a written instance where you'll have to write down and prepare a management report. Perfect. And then, do you remember with case studies, I think one mistake that students make across the board is, I'm sure you're aware of the standard management consulting framework. So you must have heard of Porter's 5 Forces or the 4 Ps framework, the 6 P framework. Do notice that what sets technology and digital consulting roles apart is that there isn't a standard framework that you can leverage from your business modules, right? So you can bring in the 4 Ps very briefly, you can bring in the competitor positioning diagram very briefly, but if that's the sole focus of your management consulting or case study report, then unfortunately those candidates actually don't proceed to the next group, right? So what I will show you is how you can alter a traditional framework to make it relevant to digital and case study interviews. Perfect. Yes, so as I was saying, unlike the standard case study interviews, try and avoid using generic business assessment models because these are not relevant to digital and tech consulting roles, right? And then I've given you 2 reasons why this is the case, and recruiters say this to students as well all the time, right? So this was gathered from post-recruitment feedback or post-interview feedback. So first of all, one reason why applicants don't make the assessment center rounds is because they use very general frameworks that do not place a significant or a high emphasis on the firm's specific technological capabilities. So for example, if you were applying for this role in Amazon, if you didn't show any awareness at all of Amazon's technological capabilities, then that's an immediate red flag. Yep. And then secondly, traditional frameworks give you a high level understanding of how you can solve business problems. However, they're not agile enough, right? So for example, if you think about Porter's 5 Forces, Porter says that there's 5 impacts that businesses need to consider. So competitor forces, pricing impacts, the threat of new buyers, the threat of new competitors, clients coming in, right? So the thing with that model is that it assumes that nothing is technologically changing, right? So again, try and stay away from traditional business models and instead leverage a model that's specific to a consulting role. Any questions at this stage? Okay, great. So in that case, what I wanted to do now is review the problem statements as they relate to sustainable fashion. So I sent you a case study. Again, this case study mirrors a case study which you will actually see in an assessment center at one of the big 4 accounting firms, right? So it's tailored to ensure that it's as relevant to what you will actually see in the assessment cycle. So for those of you who haven't had a chance to read this yet, again, a lot of text, and even though it was sent to you a few days before, in the actual assessment center, you'll only be given 10 minutes maximum to read it, right? So again, try and practice reading things really quickly, try and pick up what's most relevant. Sometimes they will give you a lot of irrelevant information, and then you'll have to figure out which of the points most pertain to the case. Which is why my first recommendation is, if you're given pages and pages of text, the first thing that you should do before solving the case is to take note of the key problem statements in the case study. So based on the text that I sent you, there are 4 critical problems that can be ascertained from the sustainable fashion case study. The first one is very apparent, right? They have said that there's a lack of success in their expansion strategy, specifically in Canada, because sustainable fashion essentially is a company that collects fashion waste, and then it has in-house operations that converts the fashion waste into accessories and clothes that it sells to clients, right? It's based in the US. However, it hasn't been able to expand to Canada because Canadian firms are very good at advertising their own in-house recycling schemes. So a bit like, I don't know if you guys remember, but H&M had a sustainable recycle program recently, a few years ago, where I think if you brought in reused clothing, then they would give you a £5 voucher, right? So similar to this, sustainable fashion doesn't have anything like this, right? So they're facing mounting pressures from firms abroad who have their in-house advertisement schemes. Yep, so expect that in the case study, 2 or 3 problems will be super apparent. And then actually the most important issue that they want you to address will be hidden, right? So they won't always make it apparent what it is that they want you to solve. So I'll take you through how you can ascertain that as well. So that's the first issue. The second one that's mentioned in the case study is decreasing profit margins. And this is where they're trying to assess your general business knowledge. So for those of you who haven't had any experience with accounting, you just have to generally know that if there's a reference to decreasing profit margins, it means that either the revenues are decreasing, the costs are increasing, or there's a combination of both, right? So even if you come from a non-business background, expect general high-level questions on how does a firm's cost model work, or how does a firm's revenue model work, right? So at a basic level, you should at least know the drivers of profitability. Great. And then don't shy away from using numbers. So sometimes if it's a very qualitative case study, they will give you percentages and numbers. And in some of the other technical case studies, they'll actually ask you to calculate things. But for this case study, the focus is not on the calculations, it's on developing an ERP solution, which is why they haven't given you significant tables with numbers. Okay, so for sustainable fashion, the problems that they're facing is that the costs of recycling have increased by 35%. They don't tell you why, they just tell you that it happened in 2020. And then similarly, the revenue numbers are also going down because there seems to be a fall in the value of the resale amount for clients, right? So clients, for some reason, don't think that reusable fashion is as good enough as it should be. And therefore, there's pricing pressures driving revenue down. Okay. Yeah, so always create a high-level table. Again, you don't have to show this to the recruiters or the assessors, but before you start typing down your responses or before you start having the interview, make sure you create a simple matrix and outline problems and then all associated factors with those problems. Great, so moving on to problem 3, this is where, again, the case study then takes a specific focus on digital issues, right? So here they're trying to tell you that the firm hasn't been able to harness the power of its data, right? So there is an ineffective data governance model here. They tell you, I think in the 3rd paragraph, that sustainable fashion has got a disparate or a multitude number of computing, financial reporting, and operational systems. And then also, an interview might ask you, well, why is this the case? And then I think a lot of students fail to actually read the background. And in the background section, they tell you that sustainable fashion has been very successful in merging with other firms really quickly. So they've been successful in expanding. However, as a result, they now have many, many systems which don't necessarily talk to each other. Yep, so they're essentially getting no insight into data duplication. They don't know what data warehouse has what data attributes. And as a result, they also give you a specific negative impact of this issue. The case study mentions that due to multiple data warehouses, unfortunately, sustainable fashion miscalculated the amount of warehouse space that it needed. And as a result, they had to buy temporary space, which was obviously impacting their cost line. Okay, great. And then the other thing that students tend to do at this stage is they immediately read the problem statement. And if you see the problem statement, I make a reference to what the chief information officer can do. So they've hired a new chief information officer to try and combat some of these problems. However, in the problem statement section, I don't make reference to the client-facing sales portal at all. So one thing that assessors will do is they'll try and throw in a problem, which is actually one of the biggest issues for the firm, but they won't necessarily mention it in the problem statement. So they want students to see if they can essentially pick up that point without making it very explicit, right? So I think the biggest issue for sustainable fashion is that even though they've got all these internal systems, they don't actually have a client-facing sales website or a sales platform, right? And therefore, in the text, I've said that there's minimal information given in the case study about this. And there also isn't a mention on why sustainable fashion doesn't have this or why it needs it. But that's essentially what you have to figure out during the case study solution. Great. Any questions at this stage? Perfect. All right, so moving on to the case study question then. So the problem statement that they want you to address is as follows. So what key considerations should the Chief Information Officer review when developing the ERP platform? And then on one of my courses, I essentially have a handout which lists all the types of platform or technological or digital terms that are used during interviews. So that's a good resource that I can share with this group too. But essentially, if someone didn't know what ERP was, then obviously you're going to really struggle with the case study. So they expect you to generally understand the types of digital solutions that firms can offer, right? So just for those who aren't aware, ERP is an enterprise resource planning software. So think of it as a bit like your phone's homepage, right? Where you've got one landing page and then you've got multiple applications listed. So you might not use all the applications, but for example, Revolut connects to your bank. So there's an interface between various applications. So an ERP works in a similar way at an organizational level. It combines or integrates multiple tech systems into one single platform, right? So if an interview asked you what this was, don't just say what it was, try and also highlight some key benefits if possible, right? So the three ones that you should always think about are, does this platform enhance efficiency in any way? Again, you don't have to be super specific, but definitely throw the keywords in. So enhanced efficiency, ERP enhances efficiency because it combines multiple platforms with disparate reports into one single streamlined platform. Yep. And then as you're aware, sustainable fashion is struggling with cost reduction. So ERP platforms can help reduce costs because they reduce instances of incorrect reports being sent out, right? Because your data is normalized. So once you have all users using the same data, then that reduces instances of stock counts being incorrect or customer sales numbers being incorrect, right? So it increases the opportunity for you to earn revenue whilst also decreasing your costs. And then finally, if you wanted a few bonus points, try and bring in some other digital components, right, that you're aware of. It doesn't necessarily have to be the one that I've listed. You can mention anything, but again, try and tailor the answer to digital concepts as much as possible. So I've made reference to cloud computing. So again, for those of you who might not be aware, cloud computing is a bit like Google Drive, right? So rather than having local files and local Excel documents or PowerPoint saved down, companies can upload all their documents, all their files on an on-demand platform online. And what that does is that it encrypts data, so it secures data. There's less instances of data leakage. You can review metrics in a real-time basis, and all users, most importantly, can access data simultaneously and they can view the same metrics. Yep. So this is really what you would need to know before you try and answer any questions on ERP platforms more generally. So a tip here that you should remember is that they will give you several pages of text, and when you're answering questions, try not focus on more than 3 or 4 key critical elements, right? So during one of my interviews, when I was first applying, I think I listed like 12 impacts, right? And their feedback was, rather than listing every single thing, I should have instead focused on just 3 points and then expanded on them, right? So less is more with digital and tech consulting interviews and case studies. Perfect. Okay, great. So moving on to the proposed case study framework and solution. So as I'd said, you don't necessarily have to shy away from generic business models. Bring those concepts in, so bring in competitor forces, bring in revenue models, bring in pricing models. But one of my favorite frameworks that I tend to reference and teach students is the DDA model, right? So this is the development, demonstration, and adoption model. So again, probably not something you've ever seen before or have come across during university studies. It's a very specific tech framework that helps users assess the feasibility of creating new technology in the firm. So what is DDA then? It's a simple yet powerful framework that helps organizations measure whether or not a new technology software will be successful or not, right? And it's got 3 stages that you need to think about. So the first D stands for development. And this is when, even before you start implementing the solution, you have to define the problem to begin with. So if you remember on the previous slide, I had outlined 4 problem statements. So when you're talking about the development aspects of the DDA framework, link your answer back to the 4 problem statements that I had shown you. Yep. And then, this is where they don't, even though the case study focuses on this, the new CIO who's about to be hired, they will give extra credit to students who think about different stakeholder needs, right? So it's not only the CIO who needs to think about development considerations, right? So if you've got customers, they'll have to obviously understand if the ERP software impacts them. Can they still place those accessory and fashion item orders? If it's a worker in the factory, how is his or her work impacted by the ERP software? So when you're looking at the development perspective, think about the effort that's needed, the time that will be taken to adopt the new technology, the costs of implementing the technology, any associated training factors that need to be considered, right? So the development stage is understanding all key stakeholder needs. Any questions on the development step? Okay, great. The next one is demonstration. And again, this is where the most successful students are able to provide some examples of KPIs or key performance indicators that would be beneficial for sustainable fashion, right? So for example, if you built an application, you built the ERP software, but you don't actually know what you will show to your stakeholders or how you will measure success, then you run into some issues, right? So the demonstration step says, how are you going to measure success? How will you quantify success? So quantification of benefits in case studies interviews are very, very important. And by the way, this is not just specific to digital consulting. For any consulting role that you apply to, try and always quantify benefits where you can. Perfect. And then finally, the last step is adoption. So you've developed the platform, you've demonstrated benefits. How are you actually going to migrate your existing processes and systems onto the new platform? And what elements should you consider, right? Okay, so the other thing I've noticed generally with students, and this is just something that comes with practice, right, is the more frameworks and case studies you practice, the better you will get at tying frameworks back to the problem at hand. Some of the best students not only link the GDA platform to the problem statement, but for each of the points, they give examples of how sustainable fashion can specifically benefit from it. So remember, in assessment centers, don't just generically list out points, right? Link back to the case study as much as possible. Okay, perfect. I think we're coming to the last two slides now. So in terms of a proposed solution, if I was given this question in an assessment center, then this is how I would go about framing a response, right? So again, I would, at a high level, draw out a 3-pillar model: development, demonstration, adoption. And then, as I'd said before, try and only focus on 3 to 4 relevant considerations. Don't think about every single thing and try and bunch in as much as you can, because that actually takes your points away from the assessment criteria. Okay, so let's think about this. So for each of these points, you would have to come up with one key consideration that the CIO needs to factor in, and then explicitly link it back to sustainable fashion, right? So one thing that I thought about was, okay, for the development stage, and this could be anything that you think about, right? The important thing is, can you justify why you're recommending that action? So for development, always try and give 2 options and then make a recommendation for which one you prefer, right? So the one that I'm thinking about is, when you're developing the enterprise resource planning software, you know for a fact that sustainable fashion already has multiple systems. So would you be modifying their existing systems and linking to the ERP software, or are you paying the ERP software provider more so that their software is modified and it can link back to your systems, right? So investments can happen at the firm level or at the ERP provider level. Can anyone think of any other development considerations? So when you're building something new, it could be anything, but any ideas at this stage? I know it's quite late in the evening. Your brain juices are probably like all used up. Come on, who's going to volunteer? Should I just pick someone? How about you again, Grace? And then I'll pick on, is that Asija?
Yeah.
Hi there.
Hi.
All right. Do you want to just throw in some ideas? Again, doesn't have to be specific to technology consulting. So if you're developing a new software, and you're the CIO, what consideration would you factor in?
So the consideration was, is it going to be in terms of just the people who are going to use it, or like to a larger area base?
Yeah, so essentially in the framework, development says you will consider the needs of key stakeholder groups, but you have to figure out who the key stakeholder groups are. So in an assessment center, possibly pick 1 or 2 and then just think about their success criteria. Yeah. Yeah, so actually like a lot of students here focus on sustainable fashions outcomes or the client's outcomes. But when I was doing this case study, I actually said, well, the CIO has just been hired, right? So when someone's just been hired, it's always their considerations that kind of take precedence, especially since they're the chief information officer. So from a chief information officer perspective, if I was to recommend to him or her that we should modify all our existing systems, then he will say, or she will say, well, that's extremely expensive, so that's not something I will do. Yep. Grace, any ideas for you? Or Joanna even?
I remember it was talking about how the warehouses, the kind of logistics were all jumbled up. So I guess like probably the efficiency thing is the most important, but I don't really have many ideas.
No, no, that's very good. So if you were to say in a case study that efficiency is more critical to sustainable fashion than for example, revenue impacts, then that's a great point. You also mentioned the fact that the warehouses had issues, right, with duplicative orders, not being able to assess stock count. So that's great. But if you want to say that that's the most important, then you would have to justify that. So one way of justifying it could be by saying that if these issues continue, then this isn't something that's a one-off instance, right? So expect to continuously have stock count issues in the warehouses. So one consideration for development is the persistence of the problem, right? But you'd have to make it very explicit. Again, any answer is a good answer as long as you can justify why you think that's the most important one.
My thinking was that if they wanted to expand into Canada, then they're adding more onto their plate. And if all their internal functions are already quite jumbled up, then there's just too much going on. So they would have to fix that out before they move on to the next business venture.
Excellent. Yes. So had you explained it that way, then yes, that would have essentially given you full marks at the development stage, right? Because not only have you linked it back to the problem, but you're actually saying that why should they focus on new expansion when instead they have internal remediation to be done, right? So yes, excellent. That's great. Well done. Great. So that's one consideration for the development phase. Then moving on to demonstration. This is where, remember, you have to determine the success criteria. So how can the CIO effectively measure success for this new ERP platform? So it's all well that they build this, right? But how are they going to show that it's actually worked? And then one of the things I was thinking about here is obviously the CIO is a new hire. He or she might want to connect the ERP platform to any new tech trends, right? So for example, can the CIO leverage cloud architecture? Can the CIO leverage analytics platforms? So visualization of metrics of performance, right? So just again, throw in those key terms that demonstrate to the assessors that you're familiar with the trends in this space. So can the CIO integrate analytics platforms or cloud architecture platforms and then come up with a way of measuring effectiveness, right? And make sure that you give specific examples of what you're measuring. So again, go back to the problem statement. Remember we said costs are spiraling, revenues are going down, expansion's unsuccessful to Canada. So the things that you should put in here are dollar amounts of cost saved, stock turnover rate improvements, again, accounting concepts, business concepts, right? Or increased revenue. So if you haven't quantified the success criteria at this stage, then again, that would indicate that, again, a stronger candidate might potentially succeed at this stage because they've measured output. Perfect. And then adoption. So this is where I think 90% of students failed to link it back to the client problem, which is the most critical one, right? Because the client platform wasn't explicitly mentioned in the problem statement, a lot of students address, for example, software integration, they address cost crunches, they addressed revenue challenges, but they don't actually talk about clients at all. So always try and focus on client-centric solutions if you can. That's always the way that these type of case studies will essentially lead you to success, right? So in terms of adoption, what I'm thinking about is how can the CIO re-engineer the ERP platform to customize the client's experience? So it's good enough that all the internal systems are aligned. How can you make sure the client actually benefits from this? So eventually, you know, if all the internal platforms are working well, then you can link them to a new client-facing portal, right? So this could be very simply just a website where clients can log in and place orders. And then in order to adopt or encourage client adoption, what are the things that you can do? So you can, again, offer digital online coupons, you can offer vouchers, you can offer loyalty schemes, You can offer incentives for clients bringing in their reused fashion, and then you can also have these sustainability campaigns, right? So if you remember, the case study says that SF has been very successful in distributing market leading sustainability campaigns. So again, if you were to bring that in, then that shows that you've linked back to the case study really well. Okay. And then, so that's one example. Discount coupons is one example. Increasing marketing digital campaigns is the other one. The third one, but obviously just pick one or two, but I'm just giving you some ideas. So the third one that I could think of is linking ERP back to the portal, right? So increasing the customer experience by reducing delivery times. So Grace, as you'd said, they had an issue with stock count and duplicative orders coming into the warehouses. So if you're able to connect a single platform to the website, then when clients place orders, you wouldn't have duplicate orders coming into the ERP system, right? So yeah, think about accurate data, streamlined data, which will essentially optimize the client experience. Okay, great. So again, like I said, multiple frameworks, but this is, I think with digital and technology consulting, there's about 5 or 6 frameworks that you can leverage. This one's a very good one because it kind of applies for any question you're given where you're asked to create a new software. Great. That brings us to the last slide, where I wanted to just reemphasize some of the general advice and tips, right? So when you're trying to develop a case study solution, as I had started with, remember, you don't have to have highly technical backgrounds or provide highly technical responses, right? So as you can imagine, I did throw in like AWS, cloud computing, big data, right, ERP, but your knowledge doesn't have to be extensive in this field. The more you read, the better, but you don't understand, you don't necessarily have to go into the technicalities of how these things work. Yep. So as long as you bring in the high-level digital technological trends, the themes, and the critical concepts, then that's sufficient for the assessment center. Secondly, there is no single right or wrong answer. So what this means is that all responses will be accepted as long as they meet 3 criteria that I've listed here, right? So if you have a response and it's logical, it doesn't immediately conflict with the case study materials, and it's supported by evidence, then they will accept that. So one problem that students would say at this stage is, I guess, if they were doing this case study, is sometimes, believe it or not, because you're time pressured, I think a student said that revenues were actually increasing and costs were going down instead of the other way around. So if you were to say that, then obviously that completely contradicts the information in the case study. So I wouldn't advise that, right? So make sure you get your key facts about the case study right, and that can be done if you were to lay it out in a framework. And then finally, try and identify hidden underlying assumptions. And this is where examiners will not provide all the information to you upfront, right? So there will be underlying hidden themes. So it's important for you to determine and deduce what this theme is. And I've given you an example here. So this is where the case study problem statement section doesn't mention the client-facing sales platform explicitly, but as a new CIO, of course, you're going to be the most interested in that because that's the best way that you can interface with clients and increase your revenue. Yep. So remember, all answers are accepted as long as they're logical and defined. You're not expected to be super technical, but do show your technical aptitude more generally. And then finally, don't just take the text on the surface, right? Try and delve into what the assessors are trying to get across to you. Yep. Okay, perfect. So that brings us to the end of the workshop. I think we have about 10 minutes or so. So let me know, guys, if you have any specific questions. It could be any question on assessment centers or case studies more broadly, or what to do if you're completely lost at this stage. All questions are welcome. Okay, so let's see if there's anything in the chat. Okay, perfect.
We have a question from Grace.
Oh, sure. Yes.
I was wondering, So in these kind of case study interviews, what are kind of other key considerations that a CIO would usually have, that maybe like what are common underlying assumptions that you usually see in these case studies, apart from this one with the client-facing sales platform?
Yes, sure, Grace. So some of the other underlying themes that are very relevant to such case studies is, so one thing you need to consider is every time there's, for example, a new CIO hired, then there's a potential that the existing team members can feel a bit threatened, right? So you'll see some other case studies where they will reference cultural change or organizational change that needs to happen. And this will not just be software related, right? So this will be the fact that employees might have to be reskilled, they might have to go into additional training programs, there might be completely different structures. So for example, some CIOs like to work with a decentralized model. So what they'll do is they literally speak to every department, see what their challenges are, and then feed the feedback upwards. Another management technique is when they prefer a centralized model. So basically the CIO will just say, I don't really care about what every single department's considerations are. I will just create a generic ERP platform and then everyone just has to adapt. So cultural changes, reskilling, training programs, those are the common themes I've seen across other assessment centers. The other very common one is on how the CIO interacts with other leads within the business, right? So for example, if the sales lead or the head of sales for sustainable fashion says, I don't want to create the new client platform, I'd rather just expand to Canada and rejig internal platforms. So then you have to actually go back to the DDA platform, the DDA model, and rework your development phase, right? Because remember, we said the development phase was we want to understand the client pain points. So if that gets shut down, you have to kind of go back to the working table and rework your whole DDA framework. Yeah, so hopefully that answers your question. But I'm hoping to release a newsletter soon with just the general themes and trends that you should remember when you're preparing for applications. And then I'm going to release a free course on just the general types of software challenges that come up. Yeah. So again, materials that are all very much targeted to digital and tech consulting roles. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
No worries. Great. Any other questions, guys? Okay, wonderful. So in that case, thank you so much, everyone, for your time. I hope you found this session useful. It's just the first of many that we're looking to do with the group. I also want to thank Mia and Joanna, who've been great with coordination and helping me come up to speed with this. But this is my first session with the University of Edinburgh, but I'm really keen to continue the partnership. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
you.
I'm just going to stop the recording now.